So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the second tabernacle services, where we find then the scripture used the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation truly comes from the prophets of the Israelic lineage, so then we can read and understand the time of the end. And then reading Mashiyach the prophet, we find the 61st chapter extremely important these days, because the Mashiyach himself, when he came, he read part of the 61st chapter as he was then completing the spring feast. The understanding of the scripture is the entire year from the barley aviv to a barley aviv becomes an entire year. During this year of the first tabernacle service, every year they would train certain feasts for the coming of the Mashiyach. So then the Creator very wisely, he brought them to the desert, indicating confidentiality, indicating seclusion, indicating cleaning up of themselves from generations of paganism. That's why the nation then went to the desert. Not the entire nation, but great portion of the nation. So they were there in the desert, and there was a section of their learning where there was some unique relationship with the Creator and His people only after Leviticus was then explained. The people had to deal with the Holy Creator as per instructions. Otherwise the Creator would not reveal Himself. These days then, where we find so many confusions regarding churches and denominations, and these denominations, they have this idea of what was in the Mashiyach and what it should be done, and the church then another denomination believes this section because then some of the apostles or whoever those were with the names changed, they would do this, that and the other, and then ended up not doing. And then there is another congregation that believes this area but not the other area. And then you begin to realize either then the Creator is mixed up, or he doesn't know what he's doing. It can't be many denominations because it depends upon your interpretation. This means going to and fro. So where did this idea of denominations came from? There is only an answer, and an answer only, from the time of deceit. The Mashiyach came after 1,000 years plus of training, from barley aviv to barley aviv, from the starting of the year to another starting of the year. They trained the feasts, so then the Mashiyach would come and complete them precisely. So then later the Mashiyach said, prior to his ascension, "Go therefore around the world. Thus far you have learned what tabernacle means. And then go and establish tabernaclings." This was simply what the Mashiyach said. What you have learned. Ever since there was then a Creator and a human being. Ever since Ibrahim, what you have learned. And experience in Egypt, and the coming through and establishment of the first tabernacle service, and the Mashiyach established the second tabernacle services. However, there was a transitional time of around 100 years, and the first holy city of the period started with Yohanan, That's why you have then Hebrews. Hebrews in the scripture gives you the updates of the first tabernacle service and then second tabernacle services. Those 7 cities of the Mashiyach in Asia Minor, Smyrna, Philadelphia, Ephesus, and so on, those cities, they were in sin. Yohanan was far away from those cities in his own city, while gathered the information in the Spirit from the Mashiyach himself, and he wrote. Then he sent the boys over there with those Megillas, with the writings, and they were straightened out. Thus then started the relationship with the holy cities and Gentiles, and went on until 1009, 6009 per the Creator's calendar. Afterwards, the Muslims then, they came to Jerusalem, and then they destroyed the tomb for the first time where the Mashiyach came from, and the city was destroyed. It was the first time the tomb was destroyed. Before then, the tomb was always intact. So then the world indicated they had no more dealings with the cities. Thus, then Nahashatan, the destroyer, went to prison. Thus, his facet of deceit started, the 1,000 years of deceit. So from 1009 to 2009, we have then 1,000 years of total deceit. You have no cities doing what they were doing, tabernacling, and no directives from heaven. The world was absolutely on its own. Thus, a requirement for a world order, because there was no order coming from the cities. Then 1,000 years has then taken place, and then we find in Daniel the statesperson, Daniel the politician. What did he say? During the time of the Babylonian Empire, the Babylonian king had a dream. And the dream of Babylon, or this Babylonian king, while he was there, then there was this huge statue. Why did then the Creator decided of a statue? Because it was popular back then. People would go in those chambers. There are dividers where you would go in those places of worship, and they had dividers over there as you would be at work. You know those partitions, and you have your desk over there, your computer. So it was back then. And they had huge big statues where people would come around and worship statues. It was popular. Worship center. Then, since the king was extremely familiar with those kinds of pagan worship, then the Creator very wisely decided to show him a specific statue, but not related with worship. It's related with his ability, the king's ability of absorbing the understanding from heaven. It would make it easier for him to understand. Then the king woke up and he wanted his close friends of sorcery to come around and not only give an interpretation, but they had to say what the dream was. And they, we can do this. No person in this earth other than the great God can give the answer. And then the king says, since you are liars and scoundrels, your families and yourselves, your houses, what you have is going to become ash. And he gave the order to Ashpenaz to go around and start destroying them. Then Daniel, the prophet, the politician, he then went and prayed, and then the Creator gave him the answer. And as then they were slaughtering the people, and they said, no, wait for a moment, take me to the king and let's have a talk. So he did. And then he explained the dream, and then the king of Babylon was extremely satisfied, and then Daniel was promoted along with his friends. So what was the situation then when Daniel was explaining? He was explaining then, obviously, he saw in a dream this huge statue and the head of gold, and then comes the silver, and then comes the bronze, and then comes the iron, and then the base of the statue was with iron and clay. Where we are at iron and clay. So then indicates each nation in charge of every time there is a change or transition from a type of metal to another type of metal. There was then Babylon, there was the Middle Persians, and then there was then Alexander the Great, and then Rome, and then came the mixture. However, the indication of the mixture, Daniel the prophet also had the understanding of the system. It was not translated properly. As we understand, if you read the Apocrypha in the Catholic scripture, you find the extras of Daniel. So there is not only a set of 12 chapters, since we don't understand chapters, we don't read numbers and verses. We have to understand the content and the context, so then we can understand layer by layer. There is no precept by precept, line by line. There is layer by layer by layer, then people understand throughout the nations and throughout the generations, layer by layer. So then, at the end of the second chapter, he was then explaining how the kingdoms would react. There is a section of it where you read in the second chapter, and the kingdoms would then be trying to adhere to each other. What does it indicate? So then, let's evaluate. When you read the same layer of understanding from the second chapter and 12, you have to understand, you have the second chapter as a guide, or if you may, the index of the understanding. Then you find the rest of it, the explanation of each of those items. So then the end of the second chapter relates with the 12th chapter, and you have to layer it properly, as you would with Gala or Revelation. Comes a point where you begin to read then the shofars. Shofars are the sounding coming from Nahashatan, because it's related with sin. You have to relate then with the first cup from the Creator, cup of vengeance. And then the second sound of shofar of Nahashatan, related with sin. Then you find the second cup related with the anger or the vengeance. So the same way you read then the understanding of Daniel, you have to understand then the layers. Comes the second, and then comes the 12th. And they complete each other. So then, we read then, shall be then, part of iron shall be part of clay. And then there is a section of it where it states, they shall be divided. But there shall be in the strength of iron, because you saw the iron mixed with the clay of the mud. And as the toes and the base were partially of iron, partially of clay, so the kingdoms shall be partially strong and partially fragile. And as you saw then the iron mixed with the clay of the clay, they shall be mixed with themselves, but they shall not adhere to one another, even as iron does not mix with the clay. So then, Daniel the politician was then obviously during this time, giving an indication of Gentile level related with faraway tabernacling. Daniel the prophet could not explain tabernacling in any means or fashion or way, because he was speaking with an absolutely pagan king. But then, from the Gentile understanding, then the Creator gave this statue related with Gentile level. He began to understand himself that it is a time of the end, where then nations would come together and adhere to each other. And then come a time where nations would be divided. So what does it mean? And the second section states then it would try to adhere to each other, but it would not. The first section would be the kingdoms would be divided, speaking the end of the legs of iron. Then the nations would be divided, but then they would try then to adhere to each other again, but they would not. When you read this in the 12th chapter related with a layer, what do you find? You find then the time of going to and fro. Conversation with the angel while he was resting. Typical of the politician Daniel after a long day working with the pagan king. He would take a walk, would go to a river, he would refresh himself in the presence of the Creator, and he would take a nap. When he was taking a nap, he had these dreams, and these dreams he had these understandings. And then he gave us very precisely. Then it stated very plainly. Then at the end, people would go to and fro. To and fro meaning confusion. Has to have a time in the earth in the future, from the Daniel's time in the future, where there is no tabernacling. That is the only meaning in the future. No tabernacling means going to and fro. And then knowledge would increase. And then nations would try to adhere to each other. So those areas of the 12th chapter, you have to layer with a second. You have to understand layerings. So you find then the politician explaining layer of understanding of the time of deceit, 1,000 years of Nahashatan. Then you have to layer not only the second chapter, the 12th chapter, then you have to read the 20th chapter of Galah, or Revelation, because Revelation is then what Daniel the politician was explaining previously. Then you find the layer over there, the 1,000 years of deceit, and then you have to retract your understanding Daniel the 12th chapter. Then people go to and fro. To and fro is confusion. So there is a time, period of time, where there is confusion in the earth. 1,000 years of confusion. So then you find nations coming together. First they were divided, second chapter. Then they came together and then tried then to have a relationship during the time of deceit, 1,000 years of deceit. But then they tried, but they would not adhere to each other. Then you read in the 12th chapter, and then knowledge would increase, indicating the end of the 1,000 years of deceit. Then comes the time of restoration. Then you have to shift then to Mashiyach the prophet. Mashiyach the 61st chapter, where he stated, then at the end, he's explaining then, coming a time where those cities laid waste for many centuries, they would then return. So then you have to understand the context and the content, these movements of layers, but they have to be done as per instructions, always reading these understandings as we read Leviticus. So you have multiple layers at the same time. if your mind can only be focused in a number or verse and has to prove you the truth every time based on a page, another page, you won't be able to understand. Layer upon layer. 2nd chapter, 12th chapter. Then you have to link with Gala, 20th chapter. And then the 20th chapter indicates a certain area and period of time. After these are lined up, and then we understand, and after these, as we would read in Yohanan, and after these, then we shift to Mashiyach the prophet, then the returning of the holy cities. By this time we understand, prior of it comes then the system, the Chinese system. Daniel the prophet indicated, and in the days of these kings, then the God of heaven shall set up a kingdom, and this kingdom shall never be destroyed. So then we have lots of indications of this time of the end. What we don't have in Daniel, the 2nd chapter? What do we not have? We don't have what's lacking. It is the system. And Daniel wrote it. As you find extras in a Catholic scripture, the Apocrypha, you find the extra writings of Daniel the prophet. You can grab any Catholic Bible, you'll find the Apocrypha. If you want to know more regarding Yirmiyahu and then the temple, when the elevator system was used, you read Maccabees. Also an Apocrypha. Those are scripture, inspired scripture. What is lacking in our understanding is because Daniel starts with a head of gold, indicates then a system of rulership. Middle Persians, another system of rulership. And then you find Alexander the Great, another type of rulership. Then you find the Romans, another. Then when it comes to the end, you have to have another system. Because Daniel indicates systems. Those is explaining these kingdoms. There is the lacking of indicating this system. You can be sure of it, it was there. How do we find the answer? Yohanan. Yohanan indicated. Do we not make a layer of understanding from the 2nd chapter and 12th chapter and then Gala, Revelation? The same way we understand the nation of the end and its system, making a layer with Yohanan, the 8th chapter, where then you'll find the 3rd part of the ships, indicating amongst the nations of the time of the end, a nation particularly leading then the market, because Daniel was a market person. Then you understand the layer during the time of Gala. Then you find every nation in the world doing trade with China, as you would find the layer in Daniel. The original manuscripts did explain it. Has to have it. I don't care if you are then any person to study the Word, or if you are from set apart or non-set apart whatsoever out of the planet, there is a set of scripture explaining it, because makes a layer with Yohanan. And every section of the scripture thus far lines up with Gala in every section except the nation of the leadership of the trade of the end. Obviously, the translator did not understand what went on. And as we find in many other sections of the scripture, those areas that did not understand, they were then left out. But then, since Yohanan was in the first holy city, and he received the instructions directly from the Messiah, directly, we understand Daniel was receiving instructions from the angel, from heaven, valid. But then we find the completion of it, because we don't have in Daniel, we find in Yohanan. Thus you find over there the third part of the ships. There is an area over there in a part of the world doing a lot of trade. Daniel the prophet knew it. So then the layer can be properly used. Then you find the time of the 1,000 years of deceit, ended in 2009 with a peak of knowledge. What does indicate high knowledge? A high knowledge indicates a nation. A nation using knowledge for the trade of the end. From a statesperson viewpoint, when you speak of knowledge, you have to speak of trade. And knowledge would increase. He's speaking of the system. Not because it's the end of time and people are learning more. No, you are learning from a statesperson, where then the knowledge would increase for the sake of trade. And China is this place doing trade with knowledge. So there they come. They come with an absolutely neutral system from nation to nation, and then links them up in an individual basis. So then when Daniel stated that nations would come together during the time of the deceit, after the nations or the kingdoms would be divided, then during the time of going to and fro, they would try to come up with adherence to each other, but it would not work. So then whatsoever we understand as Babylon system, or then Babel or Tower of Babel, kingdoms coming together and adhering to each other, those are not going to be for very long. So we can expect very understandably then United Kingdom dividing, because there is no longer a requirement for union of kingdoms. The system of Daniel explaining knowledge would increase, and then this nation would take over in charge. It is explaining of a neutral system from kingdoms, amongst the kingdoms, where they would recognize a neutral, self-regulated system, where people would recognize tabernacling. Because then comes the first son of Ibrahim and the second son of Ibrahim. First son related with trade. Second son related with tabernacling. And then you find the first son mostly in Arabia. You find the second son then Northern Africa, tabernacling. And you find in China with a neutral system amongst the nations, where then giving the Ishmaelites the privilege of helping the nations making the best decisions. However, this new system regarding great knowledge, and then the time of the end related with Ishmaelites and Ethiopites, we have to have a system where then we are able to track this neutral system from nation to nation, and this system provides them with their individuality. So they don't give credit for themselves, but they do trade with China, and they acknowledge there is a higher force providing a way so they can understand tabernacling. Because besides China, the nation that Creator wisely decided to use, the other nations, they are going to receive a very neatly system where they can do trade with. However, the only way the nation can do this is by having an absolutely exact taxation system. Every transaction, as per what the Mashiyach said when he was placed in a position of listening, he said, give to the government what belongs to the government. The nations then, they are ordered. Because of then church junkies, they tend to understand the Mashiyach. No, he was giving examples because he does not force. It only in your understanding because the Mashiyach gave an order. It wasn't the Mashiyach speaking, it was the Creator. Give to the government what belongs to the government, because the city was contaminated and they want to have the understanding of heaven, but they also want the niceties of the world. So then Yahweh, the true Creator, said, so then, give to the government what belongs to them, and God God's. You want to work this way, then scandalize? Let's make a deal, and this is the way it's going to be done. Pay taxes. Because the main understanding to have the Mashiyach then thrown in the center of the authorities of the time was to ask him regarding taxes. And the Creator wisely gave them what they wanted to hear. And along with it, then during this time of restoration, the world, the Gentiles are included. Meaning any place in this planet where the Mashiyach's instructions then are found, they must pay taxes. Because tabernacling is returning. If we want part in the Mashiyach, we must do what he said. Though we are not going to be tabernacling with him, we Gentiles, we come as often as we can to the holy city and receive then the understanding of the functions, and we hear those enlightened of the testifiers of the Mashiyach speaking of the holy instructions. So we find the system then coming shortly 36 months, and they have to be tracked. The system itself from China, no nation can hack into it. They won't be able to do it because there are so many other nations using it, they won't let it. It's going to be protected. But it's in a language where other countries can't hack into it. But they can work with it. However, there's going to be so many people doing it at the same time and earning and buying and investing and doing New York Exchange sort of situation in the computer where they can do thousands upon thousands of actions in the computer. And if there is no regulation, no taxing, it's going to be a nightmare. Because every financial institution in our country must be tracked. If there is the slightest failure in tracking any institution, then the entire country is going to go to exactly this place, because then they don't have to pay taxes. Same problem during the time of the Mashiyach. People were not paying taxes. That's why the Mashiyach then said, Give to the government what belongs them. But then during the modern times of the time of restoration, we were ordered, give it to the government. And because of knowledge increasing in the system's individuality, when relates from country to country, if they don't track, then China is going to lead the country because of the system being so influential. We already have mortgages linked up with it. There is Citigroup, Bank of China, Swift company from China specialized in internet transactions. What can you deduce what's coming in the future? And then IMF 2 years ago said we must then change our monetary system because we are printing out so much money and we won't be able then to maintain the market. What can you conclude? When the system comes, because of privacy acts of rights, protection of rights over then banking, over then financial institutions, they're going to start earning this money and the government can't have their taxes. And by the time that the system is failing, they can't come around then trying to impose laws upon those places without a fight. By the time the government is going to court and trying to do, they are far behind. So at the moment, the problem is tracking. Financial systems are not being tracked. People are earning through financial system and it's not tracked. As far as government's deductions is concerned. Yes, every time you have an investment and you have earning, you have an ID with it. It shows over there. The numbers then, they are going up because there was these changes going on. Because of these changes then went up. But then you receive an ID. A date when those changes were made. It's a form of ID. The government can go over there and then take 10% of taxes from. And any given failure in the system, when the Chinese system then is evident or then downloaded, any one system then would be the system of the others. Then people are going to be joining these because then the government does not take taxes from. And from nation to nation to nation to nation, if you have a very nice, capable laptop and you go out on the airplane, you can imagine with the Bank of China and the Citigroup they're already doing with credit card, with a debit card, what kind of card would be used then to go out and having trips, what kind of points you get, what kind of hotels you can stay, what kind of a ticket you can get. The whole works based upon their system. Then you do purchasing, then you do investment, and you receive from the same system, while then you are earning points at the same time, buying your ticket, stay in a hotel, vacation packages. In these, real time at the same time while you are traveling around the world. When the time comes, the world is going to change overnight, because these points of Daniel the prophet, Daniel the politician, Daniel the diplomat, and then Daniel the very prophet of the time of the end, he's explaining step by step what must be taking place. So it's going to be very detrimental, very dangerous if our nation does not take the proper steps. And we understand our government is a bit religious because in Ozarks they have built this huge place over there, and then they built 12 gates. They read these in Revelation. thinking they would build a city for themselves where they would be secluded from the wars of the end. Well, they were wrong. It's not going to be the way they thought, because they concocted these during the time of deceit. So they have to stay on the surface, and not only the system has to work in exacting standards by these next 36 months, but then our industry must be as it was in the 50s. Has to be completely revitalized. This means new technologies. This means, for instance, electric cars, the best in the world, trucks, buses, lines, for instance. Obviously, then the updating of the grid, simple and best computers, computers already with the Chinese system in it, with the software removing taxes from any transaction, a form of tracking of their system, and entire works must be done properly. And the only luxury a person might say would be able to do with this system is watching in front of your computer. You can behold it, but you can't change it. And you can only track where it goes and what it does, so then the government gets their share. Otherwise, caught unawares. And then, if there is any given flaw in a system of a financial system that does not have tracking, people are going over there. So then, after so much of these understandings from of old, those who were very much known in the past, there are no news. But what we can understand of the system is we have 36 months to get our entire tax code updated. This means the entire 100% updated. Every person that has a social security number and banking earning of any kind must pay taxes, real time. Because when the new system then comes, it is an absolutely direct link with the Chinese system. Then you have your banking and what you do, your credit card, because you have already the Bank of China in Citigroup, American banking, already linked up together. What are they going to search for is then closed financial institutions where they can do the trade without interference of the government. And because of the privacy rights of the government, then can't monitor it. Then the government is out. But then the government is thinking they are coming from a situation where they can revitalize the industry without understanding the systematic prophecies of Daniel, and the multi-layers of these understandings can give us then the clear path of the future. As the government thought they had some sort of a clear path in the past, and they built this huge place over there in the Ozarks, extremely expensive with 12 gates, because they thought there wouldn't be some sort of a city over there. It's absolutely the most ridiculous place you can ever imagine. They ended up being reptiles because they are incompetent to do the work. Granted, they were ignorant because they did not understand what was coming in the future. But then we do understand what's coming in the future, and we should get busy. Our taxation system must be exacting by the next 36 months. If you deal with eBay, every time you have an item sold, you pay taxes instantly. And it doesn't stay with eBay until the end of the month. At the moment you push enter, and then you pay for the item, or a person pays for your item, then taxes are removed instantly. This percentage of the government, that is a special system that goes from the cell until the government's computer. And then a person receives an ID of the payment of taxes. Instantly. If the state from where the purchase was done, or then the purchase was made, if they must have their taxes, also should be also having a second ID. Instantly, the funding goes to the state's computer. But not only eBay, then you have Amazon, you have the internet retailers, you have investments of the country, and any other place where there is earning via online, instantly taxes paid. Portion for the federal government, a portion for the state. And you can be sure of it, at the end of the year, filing for taxes is going to be extremely simple. If we can master this area for the next 36 months, then we can watch the Chinese system coming true. We can watch every movement of the system in our country, and we begin to understand the way they are going to relate with it. Obviously, they're going to try to find some sort of a neutral area where they can, have more earning without paying taxes. But there won't be any. So the natural fact, if a person then wants to have property in this country, they have to have money taken out of the system. When they do, under their social security number, they have the total over there in the government. And as they remove more money from their system, from China, under their name, then it increases the total. When it does increases the total, then they have to pay taxes. Instantly, it's monitored, and whatsoever you had from the last level up to when you make a transfer, then you pay a portion of it. You receive an ID and straight goes to the government's computer. It's not complicated, but it's very laborsome. And if we screwed up in any of these transactions, then the system jams. And as the system jams, then there is a problem in the system, then people are going to try to find another system. And then they find another financial institution where then the system is out of the jam, so then overwhelms the other system. And then twice as many IDs. So the system must work exactly. So if we compare then during the time of the Second World War, the Enigma machine, where then we, the Americans, were involved in Washington listening to those codes via Morse code of the Enigma machine, writing down those characters and did not make any sense, then later because of the study made sense, the information. Precisely what is required the next 36 months, because the Chinese are coming. They already have both banks linked up, they already have the mortgage system mixed up and linked up with it. They have this SWIFT company online that takes care of internet problems, transactions. SWIFT, S-W-I-F-T, specialized in transactions. You know what they have there? A huge, tremendous, enormous database of every movement of U.S. legal areas of U.S. transactions in the system. Every time the government does not have an updated, they don't have then the wordings properly set, They're going simply to say the government has nothing to do with it because they don't have their acts together. They have no right in asking for any of it because they do not have then the system in place. So then the government's trying to get in the system is going to be rejected. So then when the nations, they are caught then during the next 36 months without a very understanding, comprehensive, computerized system, exactly, they're going to start taking orders from China. Because then you have to justify the problem or the jam in your system, and you have to take your orders from the system itself. Only have this in mind. Any financial institution not tracked is going to become a flocking place, in quote, of other people doing trade with, because then they get more money from. As far as we can understand, then third world countries such as Africa, with huge deposits of coltan, gold, and the other important metals for modern equipment, you don't have to go very far to understand. A nice computer, a link with equipment in space, and then ships coming in and out, bringing whatsoever they want. Tractors, wires, more computers, houses. And in a very short time you have cities popping up everywhere, because they're going to do direct trade with minerals. Ships coming in by the dozens, bringing materials, basics for them to build their homes. Thus, then, the system is going to provide for each kingdom. That's why the kingdoms, they don't have to be anymore united, because the system provides individuality for each of those kingdoms as long as they are responsible. So we've got a lot of work to do.